She spent her last $10 on a dead clock shop. Her dog knew something inside was still alive. The door groaned open, and the smell of dust and old oil wrapped around her like a memory she never had. Marjorie stepped inside, unsure if she'd just made the worst decision of her life. But Bruno didn't hesitate. He walked straight past everything, past the silence, past the shadows, and stopped at one clock that hadn't ticked in decades, like he could hear something she couldn't. Would you have trusted that feeling, or walked away? The cold came up from the ground first. It moved through the thin soles of Marjorie Hale's shoes, slow and steady, like something patient. She shifted her weight, but it didn't help. Early spring in Montague Center had a way of holding on to winter longer than it should. The air looked soft, almost forgiving, but it still bit at the edges. Her breath showed in front of her face, small clouds, fading quickly. She stood on the narrow sidewalk, one hand wrapped around the strap of a canvas bag that had seen better years. The fabric was worn thin along the corners, the stitching frayed in places where it had been repaired more than once. Everything she had left fit inside it. Next to her, Bruno stood still. The German shepherd's coat caught the pale light, black along his back, fading into tan at his sides. His ears were upright, sharp, listening, not to the street, not to the distant hum of a passing truck somewhere beyond the river. To the door. Marjorie followed his gaze. The shop looked like it had been forgotten on purpose. The clapboard siding had peeled down to gray wood. The front window was covered with warped plywood, nailed in place years ago, the edges curling slightly where the weather had worked at it. Above it, a faded sign leaned at an angle, the paint barely holding on. Wainwright Clocks. She read it twice, not because she needed to, but because saying it in her head made it feel more real. Behind her, somewhere across the street, a screen door creaked open. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. She could feel it, the quiet attention, people watching from a distance the way small towns always did. Not unkind. Just careful. A man coughed. Someone said something low. The words didn't carry. She tightened her grip on the bag. $10. That was what it had come down to. 30 years in the same house. A kitchen window that faced west. A small maple tree out front that she had watched grow from a thin stick into something that gave shade. All of it gone in less than a month. Paperwork she hadn't fully understood. Her nephew sitting across from her at the table, speaking gently, explaining things in a way that made it seem temporary. Just signatures. Just arrangements. Just help. She had nodded. She had trusted him. By the time she realized what she had signed, the locks had already been changed. The memory came and went quickly, like a door opening and closing in a draft. She didn't hold on to it. Not here. Not now. There wasn't room for it. Bruno shifted slightly beside her, his body leaning forward just a fraction. Not pulling. Not restless. Just ready. "You feel it too?" she said quietly. Her voice sounded thinner than she expected, as if the cold had taken something from it. Bruno didn't look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on the door. A car passed at the end of the street. The sound faded quickly. The town settled again into that quiet that wasn't quite silence. Marjorie reached into her coat pocket. Her fingers found the folded bill. It was soft from being handled too many times over the past week. She had counted it more than she wanted to admit. $10. Enough for a meal. Maybe two, if she stretched it. Instead, she had walked into the town office that morning. The clerk had barely looked surprised. That was what stayed with her. Not shock, not concern. Just a small nod. Like this was something that happened more often than people talked about. "You're sure?" the woman had asked, her pen hovering over the paper. Marjorie had looked down at the form, the address, the description of the building. Words like "as is" and "no liability" printed in neat official lines. "I'm sure," she had said. The pen had moved. The paper had shifted. A receipt had been torn cleanly along its edge and slid across the counter. $10. The exchange had been quiet. Final. Now the key sat in her hand. It was heavier than she expected. Brass, worn smooth in places where other hands had held it. The edge pressed into her palm, grounding her in a way nothing else had all morning. She looked at it for a long moment, then back at the door. Bruno took one step forward. Just one. That was all it took. Marjorie let out a slow breath. It hung in the air between them, then disappeared. "All right," she said. She moved closer to the door. The wood was darker near the handle, worn down by years of use before it had been abandoned. She brushed her fingers against it, feeling the rough grain beneath the peeling paint. The lock sat just below eye level, old, solid. She raised the key. For a second, her hand paused. Not from doubt, exactly. Something quieter than that. The kind of hesitation that comes when there's nothing left behind you and everything ahead is unknown. She could still walk away. There were other towns, other sidewalks, other nights. But Bruno stood beside her, steady, certain. Like this wasn't a question. She slid the key into the lock. It fit without resistance. The metal turned with a low, deliberate sound. Not stiff, not stuck, as if it had been waiting. Behind her, the quiet attention from across the street didn't move closer. No one called out. No one stepped in. They watched. The lock clicked. Marjorie felt it more than she heard it. She rested her hand against the door, the wood cool beneath her palm. For a moment, she stood there, listening. Not for anything specific, just listening. Bruno's ears twitched. His posture sharpened, every line of him focused forward. Marjorie glanced down at him. He didn't move. He didn't need to. Something inside that dark, boarded-up shop had his full attention. And for reasons she couldn't explain, not yet, it had hers too. She pushed the door open. Slowly. The hinges gave a quiet, reluctant groan, the sound stretching out into the still air. And the darkness inside shifted, just enough to make space for them. Marjorie stepped forward. Bruno followed without hesitation. The door closed behind them with a soft, final sound. Outside, the town returned to its distance. Inside, something else waited, and neither of them looked back. The air changed first. It carried a smell that had settled deep into the walls. Dust, old oil, and something faintly metallic, like pennies left too long in a drawer. Marjorie stood just inside the doorway, letting her eyes adjust. The light behind her stretched across the floor in a narrow strip, catching particles that drifted slowly, undisturbed. Bruno moved ahead, his paws quiet against the wood. Marjorie closed the door gently behind her. The sound was soft, but it seemed to seal something. The street, the watching eyes, the cold sidewalk, it all stayed on the other side. She stood still for a moment. Then she took a breath. It felt different in here, heavier, like the room had been holding it for years. She set her canvas bag down near the wall and rubbed her hands together, more out of habit than warmth. Her fingers still felt stiff from the cold outside. Bruno circled once, slow, deliberate, taking in the space. His nose lifted slightly, testing the air. He didn't rush. He didn't explore the way most dogs would. He was measuring. Marjorie watched him, then let her gaze drift across the room. Shelves lined one wall, tilted slightly, their surfaces bare except for the faint outlines of where objects had once rested. A long workbench ran beneath them, its surface scarred with small cuts and stains that told a history she couldn't read yet. The floor creaked as she took a step forward. The sound echoed softly, then disappeared into the stillness. Stillness. That was the first word that came to her. Not quiet. Not exactly. Quiet had life in it, breathing, shifting, waiting to be broken. This felt different, like something had been taken away. She walked further in, her steps slow, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the cracks in the boarded window. The shadows moved slightly as she passed, stretching and folding along the walls. Bruno stopped near the center of the room. He didn't sit yet. Not this time. He just stood there, alert, his body angled toward the back. Marjorie followed his line of sight, but the room still held too many shapes, too many shadows for her to make sense of it all at once. She exhaled slowly. Her breath didn't fog here. That struck her in a small, quiet way. She wasn't outside anymore. For the first time in days, she wasn't exposed. The thought came without warning. And with it, something else. A memory. Her kitchen. Late afternoon light through the window above the sink. The hum of the refrigerator. The soft click of the wall clock that had hung there for years, marking time in a steady, familiar rhythm. She used to stand at that sink and listen without thinking about it. Noticing nothing. Because nothing needed to be noticed. Everything was already in place. The memory shifted. Papers on the table. Her nephew sitting across from her, sleeves rolled up, speaking in that careful, reassuring tone. "You don't have to worry about any of this anymore, Aunt Marjorie. I'll take care of it." She had believed him. Not because she was naive, because she was tired. Tired of paperwork, tired of small repairs, tired of the quiet that had crept into the house after her husband passed years ago. Tired of being the one who handled everything. He had offered to carry it for her. So she let him. The pen had felt heavy in her hand that day. She remembered that now. Not the words on the page, not the exact conversation, just the weight of the pen. And the way Bruno had stood in the doorway, watching. He hadn't liked her nephew. He had never barked, never growled. But he had watched. The memory faded. Marjorie blinked, bringing herself back to the room. She moved toward the workbench and ran her fingers lightly across its surface. Dust clung to her skin, fine and dry. She rubbed it between her fingers, feeling its texture. Time settled into powder. She let her hand fall. Bruno shifted again, a quiet movement that pulled her attention back to him. He had taken a few steps forward, toward the back, toward something she still couldn't fully see. "Easy," she murmured, though there was no urgency in his posture. He wasn't anxious. He wasn't afraid, just focused. Marjorie picked up her bag and carried it with her, moving deeper into the shop. The floor dipped slightly in one place, the wood worn down from years of use. She adjusted her step without thinking, her body remembering how to move through spaces like this. Small adjustments. quiet awareness. It was how she had lived most of her life. Not taking up more space than necessary. Not asking for more than was offered. Not noticing when something was missing, until it was already gone. She stopped a few feet behind Bruno. From here she could see it. The tall shape at the back of the room. A clock. Even in the dim light, it stood apart from everything else. Taller than she expected, its wooden case dark and solid, reaching nearly to the ceiling. The glass panel in the front was clouded with age, but intact. The hands were still, frozen in place. She felt it again. That same quiet sense. Not just that the clock wasn't running, but that something about it wasn't right. Bruno lowered his head slightly, his nose pointing toward it. Then he looked back at her. Just once. It wasn't a command. It wasn't even a request. Just a look. As if to say, "This is where it is." Marjorie swallowed, her throat dry. She didn't answer him. Not out loud. But she stepped forward anyway, slowly. The room seemed to hold its breath with her. And in that stillness, something became clear in a way she hadn't expected. The silence she had been carrying with her, the one that followed her out of her house, down the street, into the cold mornings and uncertain nights. It wasn't the same as this. That silence had been empty. This one felt like it had a shape, like it was waiting to be understood. Marjorie stopped just short of the clock. Her hand hovered slightly, unsure if she should touch it. Behind her, the rest of the shop faded into shadow. In front of her, the stillness settled deeper. Bruno sat down beside her, patient, unmoving, as if he had been here before, as if he had been waiting for her to catch up. Marjorie drew in a slow breath. And for the first time since everything had fallen apart, she didn't feel like she was standing in the middle of nothing. She felt like she was standing at the edge of something she didn't yet understand. And that was enough to keep her there. For now. Marjorie stood in front of the tall clock, her hand still hovering in the air, not quite touching, not quite pulling back. Up close, the wood told its own story. Deep scratches along the lower panels, faint rings where something had once rested too long on top. The finish had dulled over the years, but underneath it, the structure held firm, solid, built to last longer than the people who made it. She leaned in slightly. The glass was clouded, but she could still make out the face. White enamel, Roman numerals, thin black hands frozen just past 3:3:12. The time meant nothing to her. And yet, it stayed with her. Bruno didn't move. He sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth from his body against her leg. His gaze never left the clock. Not curious, not confused. Certain. Marjorie lowered her hand slowly until her fingers brushed the edge of the wooden case. The surface was cold. Not the sharp cold of outside air, but the kind that came from stillness, from something that hadn't been touched in a very long time. She pressed her palm flat against it. Waited. Nothing. No vibration. No faint movement beneath the wood. No hint that anything inside was alive. She had expected that, of course. The clock wasn't running. Still, she waited a second longer. Then she pulled her hand back. The silence in the room settled again, deeper now, as if her small movement had stirred something that quickly returned to rest. She turned her head slightly, taking in the rest of the shop again. Now that her eyes had adjusted, more details began to show themselves. The shelves weren't empty after all. Not completely. A few scattered objects remained, small metal parts dulled with age, a broken glass dome pushed into the corner, a narrow drawer half open beneath the workbench, its contents hidden in shadow. The air carried that same layered smell, dust over oil, oil over time. Marjorie stepped away from the clock, just a few paces, her shoes brushing lightly against the floor. The boards responded with quiet, uneven creaks, each step sounding slightly different from the last. She moved toward the workbench, ran her fingers along its edge. There was a pattern to the marks, tiny cuts, grouped in places, as if someone had worked here with careful, repeated motions. Not careless damage, not neglect. Years of it. She bent slightly, pulling the half-open drawer the rest of the way out. Inside were tools, small, precise. A pair of tweezers with narrow tips, a screwdriver no longer than her finger, a cloth folded into itself, stiff at the edges. She picked up the screwdriver. It felt balanced in her hand, despite its size, worn smooth along the handle, shaped by whoever had held it most. She turned it once between her fingers, then set it back exactly where it had been. Bruno's nails clicked softly against the floor behind her. She glanced over her shoulder. He hadn't moved far. Just a step or two, still facing the clock, still watching. "You're not interested in anything else, are you?" she said quietly. Her voice carried more easily now, filling the space without echoing too sharply. Bruno's ears flicked at the sound, but he didn't look away. Marjorie straightened. Her eyes followed his again. Back to the clock. It stood there the same way it had when she first saw it, tall, still, waiting. But now, with the rest of the room beginning to settle into her awareness, it felt different. Less like an object, more like a center point. Everything in the shop seemed to lean toward it, even if only slightly. The angle of the shelves, the way the floor dipped just before it, the way the light from the cracks in the boards seemed to fall just short of its base. She took a step closer, then another. The air near the back wall felt cooler. Or maybe it was just the absence of movement. She reached out again, this time resting her hand more firmly against the side of the case. Her fingers traced along the edge of the glass door. There was a small latch. Old, but intact. She paused, looked down at Bruno. He shifted his weight slightly, then sat again, more deliberately this time. Waiting. Marjorie let out a slow breath. "All right," she murmured. Her fingers closed around the latch. It resisted for just a moment, then gave. The sound was soft, but clear in the quiet room. She opened the glass door slowly. The hinges moved without protest, just a faint whisper of metal on metal. Inside, the clock revealed itself. Brass plates, dulled but still catching what little light there was. Gears interlocked in a pattern that made sense even if she couldn't fully read it. The pendulum hung motionless, its weight centered, waiting for a force that wasn't there. She leaned in slightly. The smell shifted again. Less dust here. More oil. Old, but preserved. She brought her ear closer, without thinking. Listened. Nothing. No tick. No movement. No faint echo of what should have been. Just the same deep, settled silence. But now it felt specific, as if the absence itself had weight. She pulled back slowly. Her eyes moved over the mechanism again, more carefully this time, looking, noticing. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, but something in her, something quiet, something she hadn't used in a long time, told her that this wasn't just a broken clock. Bruno stood up. He stepped closer, his nose lifting toward the open case. Then, gently, he pressed it against the lower edge of the wood. Not sniffing. Touching. Holding there for a moment, then pulling back. He looked at her again. The same look as before. Steady. Certain. Marjorie felt it settle in her chest. That same feeling from earlier. Not confusion. Not fear. Something else. She closed the glass door slowly, her hand lingering on the latch before letting it fall back into place. The click sounded final. She stepped back. The room seemed to shift with her, the shadows settling into new shapes as the light adjusted. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Marjorie turned away from the clock. Not because she was done with it, but because she understood, in a quiet, instinctive way, that whatever this was, it wasn't going anywhere, and neither was she. Bruno stayed where he was, sitting at the base of the tall, silent clock, watching it, as if he had already decided something Marjorie had yet to fully understand. The shop held its breath around them, not empty, not forgotten, just waiting. And now she could feel it too. The feeling stayed with her as the light faded. It didn't leave when she stepped away from the clock. It didn't fade when she moved back toward the front of the shop, where the last of the daylight pressed through the cracks in the boarded window. It lingered, quiet and steady, like something that had settled into the room long before she arrived. Marjorie set her bag down near the workbench again. She opened it slowly, taking stock out of habit more than necessity. A folded sweater, a small tin of crackers, a bottle of water, half full. Nothing new, nothing unexpected. She closed the bag. For a moment she stood there, unsure of what came next. There was no plan. There hadn't been one when she handed over the $10 that morning. No clear thought beyond the next step, then the next. It had been easier that way. Cleaner. Now the day was ending, and she was still here. Bruno moved past her, his nails tapping lightly against the floor as he circled the room once more. Slower this time, more deliberate. He paused near the back again, near the tall clock, then turned and walked back toward her. He stopped close enough that she could reach down and rest her hand on his head. She did. His fur was warm beneath her palm, thick and steady. He didn't lean into her, didn't shift. He just stayed. "You picked it," she said quietly, "so we'll stay." Her voice sounded more certain than she felt, but it was enough. She looked around the room again, this time with a different kind of attention. Not searching, assessing. The floor near the back wall was clearer, less debris, less dust. It wasn't clean, but it was usable. She walked over and nudged a loose board with her foot. It creaked, then settled. Solid enough. She moved back to the workbench and pulled the canvas bag along with her. From it, she took the sweater and folded it twice, placing it on the floor near the wall. Then she lowered herself down. Slowly. Her knees protested first, then her back, the stiffness of the day settling in all at once now that she had stopped moving. She adjusted the sweater beneath her head and stretched out on the floor. The wood was cold. It came through immediately, pressing into her side, her shoulder, the back of her legs. She shifted once, trying to find a better position, but there wasn't one. This was what there was. She pulled her coat tighter around herself. Bruno circled once beside her, then lay down at her feet, his body angled toward the room, not toward her. Watching. always watching. The light dimmed further. The narrow strip that had stretched across the floor slowly faded, retreating back toward the door, then disappearing altogether. Shadows took its place. The room changed again. Shapes softened, edges blurred. The tall clock at the back became a darker outline against an already dark wall. Marjorie lay still, her eyes open. She wasn't tired, not in the way sleep needed. Her body was worn, yes, her muscles heavy, but her mind, it kept moving. She listened. At first, there was nothing. Then, slowly, other sounds began to surface. The building settling. A faint shift somewhere above, like wood adjusting to the drop in temperature. The soft tick of something expanding or contracting inside the walls. The distant hum of a car passing far away, muffled by distance and wood. And underneath it all, that same silence. But now, lying here, it felt different again. Closer. She turned her head slightly, her gaze drifting toward the back of the shop. Toward the clock. Even in the dark, she could feel its presence. A stillness that wasn't empty. A pause that hadn't been broken in a long time. Bruno lifted his head. Just slightly. His ears moved, catching something she couldn't hear. Then he let out a low sound. Not a bark, not even a growl. A soft, uneasy whine. Marjorie's chest tightened. She pushed herself up on one elbow, looking toward him. "What is it?" she whispered. Bruno didn't answer, of course. He didn't move from his spot. He just kept his head raised, eyes fixed on the same point in the darkness. The clock. Marjorie followed his gaze again. There was nothing there. Just shadow. Just the outline of wood and glass and still metal inside. She waited. The moment stretched. Then Bruno lowered his head again, slowly, resting it back on his paws. The sound stopped. The room settled. Marjorie eased herself back down, her body sinking into the hard floor once more. But now she was more aware. Every small sound seemed sharper, every shift in the air more noticeable. She pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders. Time passed. She wasn't sure how much. Minutes, maybe. Maybe longer. The darkness deepened until the room was no longer a room, but a collection of shapes she remembered rather than saw. Her eyes adjusted, then gave up. She closed them, opened them again. Still the same. She exhaled slowly. "You're all right," she murmured, though she wasn't sure if she meant it for Bruno or for herself. Her voice sounded smaller in the dark, but it held. Bruno didn't move. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. Eventually, her body began to give in. Not fully, not deeply, but enough for her breathing to slow. Enough for the edge of exhaustion to take hold. She drifted, not into full sleep, into something lighter, where thoughts blurred at the edges, where sounds became distant, where the weight of the day loosened just a little. And in that space, something stayed with her. Not a dream, not an image, just a feeling of something unfinished, something waiting. She shifted slightly, her hand brushing against the floor. The wood was still cold, still solid, still real. Outside, the night moved on without her. Inside, the shop held its quiet, unchanged. Bruno lifted his head once more, just briefly. His ears flicked toward the back of the room, then forward again, alert, patient, as if he were listening for something that hadn't happened yet. And in the stillness that followed, the silence didn't feel empty at all. Morning came slowly, not with sunlight at first, but with a faint shift in the air. The cold eased just enough to be noticed. The darkness softened at the edges. Marjorie opened her eyes. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. The ceiling above her was unfamiliar. Pressed tin, patterned faintly, catching the earliest hint of gray light leaking through the boards at the front of the shop. Then it came back. The door, the key, the clock. Bruno. She turned her head. He was already awake, sitting near the back of the room, facing the same direction. The clock. He hadn't moved much during the night. His posture was steady, alert, as if he had been waiting for her to catch up again. Marjorie pushed herself up slowly. Her back protested, stiff from the hard floor. Her shoulder ached where it had pressed into the wood. She winced slightly, then rolled her neck to ease the tension. "Not exactly a bed," she murmured. Bruno flicked an ear at the sound of her voice but didn't turn. Marjorie sat there for a moment, letting her body adjust. Then she stood. The cold floor met her again, but it wasn't as sharp now. Maybe her body had already started to accept it. Or maybe something else had shifted. She reached into her bag, took a small sip of water, then closed it again. No sense using more than she had to. Her eyes drifted toward the back of the shop, toward Bruno, toward the clock. He was already there, already focused. It struck her then. He hadn't lost interest. Not overnight. Not after exploring. Not after rest. Whatever had caught his attention, it hadn't let go. She walked toward him. Slow steps. The boards creaked again, softer now in the early light. When she reached him, she stopped just behind his shoulder. He didn't move, didn't look at her. He just stayed fixed on the clock. "What is it?" she asked quietly. This time, there was something different in her voice, not uncertainty, something closer to willingness. Bruno shifted slightly. Then, without hesitation, he stepped forward. He lowered his head and pressed his nose against the lower panel of the clock case, not sniffing, not searching randomly. He touched a specific spot, held it there, then pulled back and looked at her. Direct, intent. Marjorie felt it again, that quiet certainty from yesterday, but stronger now, clearer. She crouched down slowly beside him, her knees bending carefully. Up close, the wood showed more detail, fine cracks along the grain, slight discoloration where hands might have touched it years ago. She reached out and ran her fingers along the same area Bruno had touched. The surface felt no different at first, just wood. Cold. Still. She pressed a little harder, paused, waited. Nothing. She exhaled, her breath brushing lightly across the panel. "All right," she said under her breath. "Let's see." She stood again and moved to the front of the clock. The glass door stared back at her, clouded but intact. Her hand hovered over the latch. She hesitated. Not because she was afraid, because she didn't yet understand what she was looking for. But Bruno stood behind her now. Close. Waiting. That was enough. She opened the latch. The soft click echoed faintly in the quiet room. She pulled the glass door open. The hinges whispered. Inside, the mechanism sat exactly as it had the night before. Still. Silent. She leaned in closer this time. Her eyes adjusted to the details. Brass plates, gears interlocked in careful patterns, the pendulum hanging motionless. And then, She noticed it. Not something present, something missing. She frowned slightly, her head tilting. There was space where there shouldn't be. A gap, subtle, but wrong. She stepped back, then leaned in again, looked more carefully. The housing where the mainspring should have been. Empty. She stared at it. The absence felt deliberate. Not broken, not worn out. Removed. She straightened slowly, her mind working through it. Why would someone take that out? She murmured. Bruno shifted again behind her. He stepped closer to the side of the clock, then back toward the same spot he had touched before. He pressed his nose there again. Firm. Certain. Marjorie moved around the side. Her fingers followed his lead, tracing along the edge of the wood. And that was when she saw it. The screws. They didn't match. Not quite. Slightly newer, slightly brighter, subtle but once noticed, impossible to ignore. She leaned in closer, her eyes narrowing. Someone had been here. Not recently, but after the clock had been built, after it had been placed, after everything else had settled. Her pulse quickened, just a little. She placed her palm flat against the panel again. This time, it felt different. Not because the wood had changed, because she had. Because now she was looking, really looking. Bruno stepped back slightly, giving her space, but he didn't leave. He watched, waiting. Marjorie stood there, her hand resting against the wood, her eyes moving from the screws to the edges of the panel, to the seam where it met the rest of the case. A quiet realization began to take shape. Slow. Careful. Not fully formed yet. But there. This isn't just a clock, she said softly. The words barely filled the room, but they felt right. Bruno's ears flicked. The room held its silence, but it had changed again. Not empty, not waiting, now. It felt like it was beginning to answer. And for the first time since she stepped inside, Marjorie didn't feel lost. She felt directed. The feeling didn't rush her. It didn't push her forward. It settled in her chest like something steady, something she could lean on. She stood beside the clock, her fingers still resting near the panel where the screws didn't match. Bruno stayed close, his body angled toward her now instead of the clock, watching her, not it. Waiting for her next move. Marjorie took a slow breath, then another. She stepped away. Not far. Just enough to look at the clock as a whole again, from top to bottom, from the worn crown molding at the top, down along the glass panel, to the base where Bruno had first pressed his nose. Everything about it spoke of Tim. Not just in years, in use, in hands that had opened it, adjusted it, cared for it, and then stopped. She moved to the front again and opened the glass door once more. This time her movements were slower, more deliberate. She leaned in, bringing her face closer to the mechanism. Her eyes followed the line of the gears, the pivots, the narrow spaces where each piece connected to the next. She didn't know the names for most of it, but she understood patterns. Order. What belonged where, and what didn't. The empty space stood out now, unmistakable. Where the mainspring should have been, there was only a hollow. Clean. Too clean. Not the kind of absence that came from wear or damage. This had been done on purpose. Carefully, she straightened again. Her hand moved to the edge of the case, then around to the back. Bruno followed. Quiet. Close. She crouched slightly, bringing her eyes level with the back panel. The screws caught what little light there was. They weren't bright, but they weren't as dull as the rest. Not original. Replaced. At some point. Her fingers hovered over them. She didn't touch them yet. Instead, she traced the seam of the panel. Felt where the wood met wood. There was a slight difference, not visible at first glance, but under her fingers, she could feel it. A faint line, a break in the grain, a section that didn't quite belong to the rest. Her pulse picked up. Just a little. Not fear. Recognition. Bruno shifted beside her. He lowered his head again and pressed his nose to the same spot, then lifted it, looked at her. That look again. Steady. Certain. As if to say, here. Marjorie nodded slightly, almost without realizing it. All right, she whispered. She stood and moved back to the workbench. The drawer she had opened the day before was still slightly ajar. She pulled it open again. The small tools lay exactly where she had left them. Untouched. Waiting. Her hand hovered over them for a moment. Then she picked up the small screwdriver. It fit in her hand easily. Balanced. Familiar in a way she couldn't explain. She turned it once between her fingers, then walked back to the clock. Bruno stepped aside this time, giving her space, but staying close enough to watch. Marjorie knelt again in front of the back panel. She placed the tip of the screwdriver against the first mismatched screw. Paused. The room felt different now. Quieter. Not because there was less sound, because there was more attention. She could feel it in the air, in the stillness, as if the room itself was waiting for her to continue. She pressed lightly, turned. The screw resisted for a moment, then gave. A soft, dry sound as the threads loosened. She kept turning slow, careful. The screw lifted free. She set it gently on the floor beside her. One. She moved to the next. Same motion. Same resistance. Same quiet release. Bruno shifted once, his weight adjusting, but he didn't interrupt. Didn't move closer. He just watched. By the third screw, her hands had steadied. The uncertainty from before had faded, replaced by something simpler. Focus. She worked through them one by one, each screw coming free with that same dry, deliberate sound, until there were no more. She sat back slightly on her heels. The panel remained in place. For a moment, nothing changed. Marjorie looked at it, then placed both hands against the wood. Flat. Feeling for movement. She pressed gently. Nothing. Then a little more. A faint shift. Barely there. But enough. Her breath caught slightly. She adjusted her grip and pulled. The panel resisted at first, then loosened. A small, quiet separation. Dust fell from the edges as the wood moved. She pulled it free slowly, careful not to drop it. Set it aside. And then, she stopped. Not because she couldn't continue. Because she understood something had just changed. Behind the panel, there was space. A narrow cavity between the clock case and the wall. Dark still. hidden. Bruno leaned forward slightly, his ears rising, but he didn't move in. He waited. Marjorie stared into the opening, her eyes adjusting to the darkness inside. Her hand hovered just at the edge, not reaching in yet, not touching anything. Her heart beat a little faster now, not from fear, from the weight of the moment. Whatever had been missing, whatever had been removed, it hadn't been random. It had been hidden. And now she had found where. The room held its breath around her. And for the first time since she stepped inside that morning, the silence didn't feel like waiting anymore. It felt like it had just been answered. Marjorie didn't move right away. She stayed where she was, kneeling on the floor, hands resting lightly on her thighs, eyes fixed on the dark opening behind the clock. It wasn't large, just enough space for something to be hidden, something that had been placed there on purpose. Bruno shifted beside her, his body leaning forward slightly, his nose lifting toward the opening. He didn't bark, didn't push in. He waited. Marjorie swallowed. Her hand rose slowly, hovering at the edge of the cavity. For a moment, she hesitated. Not out of fear, out of awareness. Whatever was inside had been left there. Chosen, not lost. She reached in. Her fingers moved carefully, feeling along the back wall first. Rough plaster, cool, undisturbed. Then something else. Fabric. She paused, pressed her fingers gently against it. It didn't move at first, then shifted slightly under her touch. Wrapped. Her hand closed around it. She pulled slowly, careful not to tear or catch on anything inside. The object came free with a soft scrape against the wood. She brought it into the light. A bundle. Wrapped in cloth that had once been canvas, now stiff with age, its color faded to something between gray and brown. Dust clung to it. She brushed it lightly with her fingers. The shape beneath the cloth was solid, cylindrical, heavy. Bruno stepped closer, his nose lowering toward it, but he didn't touch. He watched. Marjorie set the bundle gently on the floor in front of her. Her hands trembled slightly now. Not from weakness, from the weight of the moment. She unwrapped the cloth slowly, layer by layer. The fabric came away in quiet folds, releasing a faint metallic scent that rose into the air. Inside, a metal cylinder. Brass, darkened with age but still intact, smooth along the sides, with faint scratches that caught the light. She turned it slightly in her hands. It wasn't sealed shut. Not completely, but it had been closed with care. She set it down. Next to it, something else slipped free from the folds of cloth. Paper. Folded. Thinner than it should have been, edges brittle. She stared at it for a moment, then picked it up. It felt fragile, like it might come apart if she moved too quickly. She unfolded it carefully. The paper resisted at first, then gave, opening in slow, uneven creases. Handwritten. The ink had faded, but the words were still clear. She read. Her voice barely more than a breath. To whoever finds this. The words settled into the room. Bruno lowered himself to the floor beside her, his body pressed close, his head resting just near her knee. She continued. My name is Thaddeus Wainwright. The name hung there, part of the building, part of the sign outside. Now, a voice. Not gone. Just delayed. I have repaired the clocks of this town for most of my life. Marjorie's eyes moved steadily across the page, each word pulling her deeper into something she hadn't expected. I removed the mainspring from the regulator because it is the heart of the clock. Without it, the clock is silent. With it, it lives. She glanced toward the clock behind her. Still. Waiting. Then back to the letter. I leave it here, along with what I have saved, for the one who understands what is missing. Her breath caught slightly. She looked again at the cylinder. At the space behind the panel. At the screws she had removed. Everything connected. Not by accident. By design. Bruno shifted slightly, his head lifting just enough to look at her face. She reached down, her hand resting briefly against his neck. Grounding. Then she looked back at the letter. A shop without a clockmaker is only a room. A clock without its spring is only a shell. The right hands will know the difference. The words stayed with her. Not loud, not dramatic, just certain. She lowered the paper slowly, her fingers still holding its edges. The room felt different now. Not quiet. Not still. Alive in a way she couldn't fully explain. She turned back to the cylinder. Her hand rested on it. Then she opened it. The lid came free with a soft, worn sound. Inside, small shapes caught the light. Coins. Gold, stacked, pressed together in careful rows. She stared at them. Didn't reach in. Didn't touch them right away. Just looked. The weight of it settled in slowly. Not just the value. The intention. Someone had placed this here. Not to hide it forever. To be found. Bruno leaned forward slightly, his nose close now, but still he didn't interfere. He watched her. Marjorie closed the lid again. Gently. Her hands steadied. The tremor faded. She set the cylinder beside the letter, then leaned back, her shoulders resting lightly against the wooden frame of the clock. The wood was still cold, but it felt different now. She closed her eyes for a moment, not to escape, to take it in. When she opened them again, she looked at the clock. At the empty space where the mainspring should have been, then at the cylinder, then back again. A quiet understanding began to settle, not fully formed, but enough. This was never just about money, she said softly. Her voice carried across the room, didn't echo, didn't disappear. It stayed. Bruno lowered his head again, resting beside her. Calm. Certain. As if everything had unfolded exactly as it was meant to. Marjorie sat there, the letter still in her hand, the cylinder at her side, the open cavity behind the clock no longer hidden. The shop no longer felt abandoned. It felt chosen. And for the first time since she lost everything, she wasn't standing outside of something. She was inside it. Exactly where she needed to be. The thought didn't come with relief. It came with stillness. Marjorie sat on the floor, her back resting against the tall clock, the letter still open in her hands. The brass cylinder sat beside her, closed again, quiet now. The gold inside no longer caught the light. It didn't need to. She read the letter again. Not quickly. Slower this time, letting each word settle where it wanted to. The handwriting wasn't rushed. It carried the weight of someone who had taken time, Someone who had chosen each line carefully, knowing it might be read years later. Decades. She reached the end again, for the one who understands what is missing. Her fingers tightened slightly around the paper. She looked up. The shop hadn't changed. Same shelves, same workbench, same dim light filtering through the cracks in the boards. But it didn't feel the same. It felt inhabited. Not by people, by intention. She lowered the letter to her lap. Her eyes moved slowly across the room, taking it in as if for the first time. The worn edges of the workbench, the scattered tools, the faint marks left behind by hands that had worked here day after day, year after year. She imagined them. Not clearly, just enough. A man standing where she stood now, leaning over the same surface, turning small screws with steady fingers, listening for something inside the mechanisms that most people would never hear. Working. Waiting. Knowing. She looked down at her hands. They weren't steady like that. Not anymore. The lines in her skin ran deeper. Her fingers moved slower, but they still moved, still felt, still noticed. Bruno shifted beside her. He had settled fully now, his body stretched along the floor, his head resting across his paws. His eyes were half closed, but not asleep. Present. Always present. Marjorie reached down and let her fingers rest along the side of his neck. His fur was warm, grounding. "You knew," she said softly. It wasn't a question. Bruno didn't respond. But he didn't need to. She let her hand stay there for a moment longer. Then she pulled it back and leaned her head lightly against the clock behind her. The wood pressed into her shoulder. Solid. Unmoving. She closed her eyes. Not to rest. To listen. The silence was still there, but it wasn't hollow anymore. It had shape. Depth. Like a room that hadn't been opened in years, finally letting air move through it again. Her breathing slowed. Her thoughts followed. The house came back to her. Not sharply, not painfully. Just there. The kitchen table, the papers, the way her nephew had smiled, reassuring, steady, the way she had signed without reading every line. She didn't replay the moment. She didn't need to. It had already happened. Already taken what it was going to take. She let it pass. Her eyes opened again. She looked at the clock, at the empty space inside it, at the missing mainspring. Then her gaze shifted to the cylinder, to the letter, to everything that had been left behind. Not forgotten. Left. There was a difference. She pushed herself up slowly, her back stiff from sitting. The room tilted slightly, then steadied. She moved carefully, stepping around the open panel, making sure not to disturb anything she had already uncovered. The cylinder felt heavier when she picked it up again. Not because it had changed, because she understood more about it now. She carried it to the workbench and set it down. The wood gave a soft, familiar creak beneath the weight. She opened it again. This time she reached in. Her fingers touched the coins. Cool, smooth, solid. She lifted one, held it up. The light caught the edge. Gold. Real. She turned it slightly, reading the faint markings. Old, carefully kept, not spent, saved for something, for someone. She lowered it back into the cylinder, closed the lid again. Not hurried, not careful in the way someone handles something fragile. careful in the way someone handles something meaningful. She stood there for a moment, her hand resting on the closed cylinder. Then she turned back toward the clock, toward the open cavity, toward the empty space. It didn't feel empty anymore. It felt purposeful. Bruno stood and moved beside her again, his shoulder brushing lightly against her leg. He looked at the clock, then at her. Waiting. Marjorie nodded once. A small motion. But enough. "All right," she said quietly. Her voice didn't waver this time. She stepped forward. Back to the clock. Back to the place where everything had shifted. She crouched again, looking into the open space behind the panel. Her hand reached in, slower now. Not searching. Understanding. She traced the edges of the cavity, the shape, the depth, where something had been placed, where something had been removed. And then, she pulled her hand back, sat there for a moment, thinking, not in words, in feeling, in quiet recognition. She stood again. Her eyes moved to the front of the clock, to the still hands, to the silent face. She walked around it slowly, taking it in from every angle, then stopped. Right in front. Her reflection faint in the clouded glass. Older. Tired, but steady. She reached out and rested her hand against the glass. Lightly. The surface was cool, unchanging. But behind it, everything had changed. She lowered her hand, stepped back. The room felt larger now, not because it was, because she saw it differently, not as something she had entered, but as something she was part of. Bruno moved to the doorway, then turned back, checking the room once more, always aware, always watching. Marjorie looked at him, then back at the clock, then at the workbench, the tools, the letter, the cylinder, all of it, connected. Not by accident, by intention. She took a slow breath. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like something had been taken from her. She felt like something had been placed in her hands. Quietly, deliberately. Waiting for her to decide what came next. Marjorie didn't rush the decision. She stood in the middle of the shop for a long moment, letting the weight of everything settle where it needed to. The letter, the cylinder, the open cavity behind the clock. It wasn't overwhelming. It was precise. Each piece pointing to the next. She turned toward the workbench. The tools were still there, laid out in quiet order. The small screwdriver, the tweezers, the cloth stiff with time. She reached for the screwdriver again. Her fingers closed around it with more certainty this time. No hesitation. Bruno moved with her as she walked back to the clock, his steps slow and measured. He stopped just behind her, his body angled slightly outward, as if keeping watch over both her and the room. Marjorie crouched again in front of the open back panel. She looked into the empty space, then down at the cylinder, then back again. "The spring is the clock," she murmured, recalling the words from the letter. She stood and carried the cylinder back to the workbench. The lid came off easily now. Inside, beneath the layer of gold coins, something else rested. Metal. Darker. Heavier. She set the coins aside carefully, one by one, placing them in a neat line across the bench. They made soft, dull sounds as they touched the wood. When the last coin was moved, she saw it clearly. The mainspring, coiled tight inside its housing. She stared at it for a moment, It wasn't just a part. It was the missing piece. The heart. She lifted it carefully. It had weight. Not just physical. Intentional. She brought it closer, turning it slightly in her hands. The metal was worn but intact. No cracks, no visible damage. It had been preserved, protected. Waiting. Bruno stepped closer, his nose lifting slightly as she held it. He didn't touch it, but his attention was fixed, unwavering. Marjorie nodded faintly. "All right," she said under her breath. She carried it back to the clock. Every step felt slower now. Not uncertain. Measured. She crouched again, positioning herself in front of the open case. The mechanism waited, silent and incomplete. She studied it for a moment, not trying to understand everything. Just enough. Where the mainspring had been, where it needed to go. She leaned in. Her hands moved carefully, guided more by instinct than knowledge. The housing accepted the spring with a quiet resistance, then settled as she adjusted it into place. She paused, checked it again, then reached for the small tools beside her. Time passed. Not quickly, not slowly, just steadily. Her fingers worked with patience, adjusting small points, aligning edges, making sure each piece sat where it should. Bruno remained still behind her, watching, occasionally shifting his weight, but never leaving. The room held its quiet around them. Not empty. Focused. When the spring was finally seated, Marjorie sat back slightly. Her hands rested on her knees. She exhaled. The clock remained silent. For now. She stood slowly and moved to the front. The glass door was still open. The pendulum hung motionless. She reached out and touched it lightly. It swung. Once, twice, then slowed. Stopped. She stepped back, looked at the clock, then turned toward the side, where the winding key hung on a small hook she hadn't noticed before. She lifted it. The metal was cool in her hand, worn smooth, used. She inserted it into the winding arbor, paused, just for a moment, then turned. The mechanism responded immediately. A low internal shift, metal engaging metal, the stored tension of the spring beginning to release into the system. She turned again and again, each movement steady, deliberate. Then she stopped. Waited. The pendulum moved, slightly at first, then more. A gentle arc. Left, right, left, right. And then a sound. A sound. Soft. Clear. A single tick. Marjorie held her breath. Another tick. Then again. Steady. Even. The sound spread through the room. Not loud. Not sharp. But present. Alive. It moved through the wood, through the walls, through the air that had been still for so long. Tick, tick, tick. Bruno lifted his head. His ears shifted forward. He listened. Then, slowly, he sat down. Calm. Certain. As if something had been restored. Marjorie stood in front of the clock, her hands hanging loosely at her sides. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just listened. The rhythm settled into the space. Into her. Not hurried, Not uneven, just right. She stepped back slightly, giving the clock room as if it needed space to breathe. The shop changed, not visibly, but undeniably. The silence was gone. In its place, a steady presence. Time, moving again. Marjorie turned slowly, her eyes moving across the room. The shelves, the workbench, the tools. Everything seemed sharper now, defined, connected. A sound filled the space that hadn't been there before, and it changed everything. A faint knock came from the front of the shop. She froze. Bruno stood immediately, turning toward the door. Another knock. Gentle, not urgent. Marjorie looked toward the front. The boards over the window let in just enough light to cast a faint outline of someone standing outside. She hesitated, then walked forward. Each step measured. The ticking followed her, steady, unbroken. She reached the door and opened it. A man stood there, older, weathered, a cap pulled low over his brow. He glanced past her, into the shop. His eyes paused, listened, then shifted back to her. "That clock," he said quietly. Marjorie nodded once. "It's running." The man studied her for a moment, then gave a small, thoughtful nod. "My wife's got a wall clock," he said. "Stopped a few years back. Never could get it right again." He hesitated, then added, "You fix things like that?" Marjorie looked back into the shop, at the clock, at the space behind it, at everything that had just changed. Then she turned back to him. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "I do." The man nodded again. "All right then," he said. "I'll bring it by." He stepped back from the door, gave the shop one last look, then turned and walked away. Marjorie stood there for a moment longer, the door open, the cool air brushing past her. Then she closed it, turned, and walked back into the room. The ticking met her again, steady, certain. Bruno returned to his place near the clock. Lying down, at ease. Marjorie stopped in the center of the room and listened. The sound didn't fill the silence. It replaced it. Days passed, not all at once, not in big changes, in small, steady ones. The ticking stayed. It followed Marjorie through the shop, through the mornings and into the evenings, marking time in a way she hadn't felt in a long while. It didn't rush her. It didn't demand anything. It simply continued. She began to move with it. The first morning after the clock started, she woke before the light fully reached the front of the shop. Not because she had to, because something in her had shifted. She sat up slowly on the floor, the stiffness in her back still there, but less sharp than before. Bruno was already awake. He lay near the base of the clock, his head resting between his paws, his eyes open but calm. When she moved, he lifted his head and watched her. Not checking, not guarding, just present. Marjorie stood and stretched, her joints loosening as she moved. The air inside the shop still held the faint scent of oil and wood, but it no longer felt stale. It felt lived in. She walked to the workbench. The cylinder sat where she had left it, closed, undisturbed. The letter was folded neatly beside it. She didn't reach for either. Not right away. Instead, she picked up a cloth from the drawer and began to wipe the surface of the bench slowly, deliberately. The dust came away in faint gray streaks. It wasn't much, but it was something. Bruno shifted slightly, then stood and walked to the door, glancing back once before settling near it. His ears flicked occasionally at the sounds outside, the distant movement of the town waking up. Marjorie continued. She moved from the bench to the shelves, brushing away dust, straightening what little remained. Each action small, each one grounding. Time passed. The man from the day before returned, late morning. He knocked once, then opened the door partway, peering in. Marjorie looked up from the workbench. "You weren't kidding," he said, stepping inside. His voice carried a quiet respect now. "I can hear it from the street." She nodded. Bruno watched him carefully, but didn't move. The man held a wrapped object in his hands. "My wife's clock," he said. "Been sitting silent for a long time." Marjorie gestured toward the bench. "Let's take a look." The man set it down, unwrapped it carefully. A wall clock, wooden frame, worn edges, the glass slightly scratched. Marjorie leaned in. She didn't rush, didn't pretend to know everything. She just looked, listened, not with her ears at first, with her attention. Bruno moved closer, standing just behind her shoulder, watching the exchange. The man stayed quiet, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the bench. After a moment, Marjorie spoke. "It's not broken," she said. The man frowned slightly. "It hasn't worked in years." She nodded. "I know, but it's not broken." She lifted the back panel carefully, studied the mechanism, then reached for one of the small tools. The movements came easier now. Not perfect, but steady. She adjusted a piece, then another, then paused. Her head tilted slightly. She listened. Not for sound, for balance. Then she closed the panel and hung the clock gently on a nail along the wall. Waited. The seconds passed. Quiet, still. Then, a faint shift, a small movement inside. And then a tick of uncertain, then another, stronger. The man leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the clock. "I'll be," he murmured. He stepped closer, listening. The rhythm steadied. Tick, tick, tick. He let out a slow breath. "Sounds like it used to," he said. Marjorie nodded once. The man looked at her. Not with curiosity now, with recognition. "You staying?" he asked. She glanced around the shop. At the clock. At the workbench. At Bruno, who had already returned to his place near the door, calm and watchful. "Yes," she said. The man smiled slightly. "Good," he said. "Town could use someone who listens." He reached into his pocket and placed a few bills on the bench. She didn't count them. Didn't need to. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and left, carrying nothing this time. Just the memory of a sound restored. The days continued. One person became two, two became more. A woman brought in a pocket watch that had belonged to her father. A farmer carried in a rusted timepiece wrapped in cloth, each one quiet, each one careful. They didn't crowd the shop. They entered it, listened, waited, just like she had. Marjorie worked. Slowly, carefully, learning as she went, trusting what she noticed, trusting what she felt. Bruno stayed close, always near the door, always watching, but now, relaxed, certain, as if the place had settled around him, the same way it had settled around her. Weeks passed, then months. The shop changed, not in appearance at first, but in presence. The air moved differently. The light seemed to reach further. The ticking became part of the structure itself. One evening, as the light faded into a soft copper glow through the cracks in the boards, the phone rang. A sound that felt almost out of place. Marjorie turned toward it. The old receiver sat on a small shelf near the front. She hesitated, then picked it up. "Hello?" A pause. Then a voice familiar. "Careful." "Mom?" She closed her eyes briefly. Her grip on the receiver tightened just slightly. It had been a long time. "I'm here," she said. Another pause. "Heard you moved," her son said. "Someone mentioned a shop. I just wanted to see if you were okay." Marjorie looked around the room. At the clock. At the workbench. At the quiet movement of Bruno shifting near the door. She took a breath. "I'm working," she said. The words felt right. Simple. True. On the other end, there was silence. Not empty. Just listening. Then, softly, "That's good," he said. They didn't say much more. They didn't need to. When she hung up, the room felt unchanged. Steady. The ticking continued. Bruno walked over and sat beside her. She rested her hand lightly against his back. The shop stood around them, not abandoned, not waiting, alive. Marjorie looked at the clock, then at the space behind it, now closed again, the panel set back in place. Nothing visible had changed, but everything had. She moved back to the bench, picked up her tools, and continued. Because some places don't call out. They don't demand to be found. They wait. Quietly. For someone who knows how to notice what's missing. And when that person arrives, they don't give everything at once. They open, piece by piece, until what was lost no longer feels like loss at all. And Marjorie Hale, who had once stood outside with nothing but $10 and a dog, now stood inside a place that had been waiting for her all along. Not to save her, but to be understood. And in that understanding, she had found her way back to something steady, something real, something that, at last, kept time. Marjorie stood there a long moment after the call ended, her hand still resting on the receiver, like she hadn't quite let go of the sound of his voice. The clock behind her didn't rush her. It never did. Just steady, 1 second at a time.
Bruno shifted at her side, then walked slowly back to the space of the lock and lay down, the same way he had that first night, but this time there was no tension in him, no listening for something hidden. He had already found it. Marjorie looked at him, then at the clock, then at the room around her, the bench, the tools, the space that once felt empty. She hadn't been wrong when she thought she lost everything, but she had been wrong about that what meant. Because what she lost made room for something she never would have looked for on her own. Bruno had, not by thinking, not by understanding, just by refusing to work past something that didn't feel right, and somehow that had been enough. Marjorie moved back to the bench, picked up the small real revolver, and turned it once in her fingers before setting down again. She listened not to the ticking, to everything that had led to it. And for the first time, nothing felt out of place. If you had been standing where she stood that morning, would you have known to stop and listen to what was missing?